We're sitting here in front of one of Basquiat's masterpieces, a painting that has been talked about and titled variously. It's also one of the few paintings that has, in literature, 3 titles that we come across. One on top, the great spectacle, El Gran Espectaculo. One, the Nile, which Basquiat actually titled it on the back. And one, History of the Black People, which Basquiat didn't title, but in literature shows up as a title reference. I think that was more about talking about the narrative from an art historical perspective rather than Basquiat's intention. It seemed very direct for Basquiat to call a painting like that. I have a long history personally with this painting. I remember when it belonged to Enrico Navarra, who was one of the main riders of the apocalypse for Basquiat, in my opinion, who prepared a lot of people for it. He sold it about 20 years ago at auction. I was already at auction, different color auction, but in the same job or similar job. I remember it back then. It was a big spectacle to have this painting. It was just the beginning of Basquiat being acknowledged in a broader sense. We all know Basquiat as a famous person and as probably the defining artist of the last generation, definitely one of the defining artists of the 20th century, in my opinion. Back then, that wasn't the case, and that's only 15 years ago. In the 90s, very few people talked about Basquiat. He was dead for a while. He died in '88, but in the 90s, people didn't talk about him, and just in 2000, it started. So this painting came out as one of the first big splashes in the broader sense at auction. Made almost $5 million back then, which was top 10 price paid at auction for contemporary art. So just so you see the context, and then it wandered on, it went to the collection that it's coming from now, lived in this house for a very long time, and now it's back. So let me start with Dieter. Dieter, let me start with you. How do you put this? This painting is, in my opinion, different than many other Basquiats. How do you put this in the context of Basquiat?
It's definitely one of his most important paintings he ever did. It is, I use the term history painting, but we are going to discuss the term. It's a Western art historical term later on, but in the sense of that it describes the slave trade. It is referencing the Middle Passage, Black Atlantic, and it is so complex in all of the words, the symbols, the signs, that you can really follow the journey. But there's double meanings all over. So you have Memphis on the one hand side, which was the old capital of ancient Egypt. On the other side, Memphis, Tennessee. And he marks it. But then he, with Thebes, he actually marks that after Memphis, Thebes will become the new capital. So he actually marks like a historic development just with 3 words and sets the tone, because he speaks about the ancient high civilization and culture of Egypt. And from there takes it to through stone drawings, ancient stone drawings. He takes it to esclave, the slave, interestingly using the French word as well as the English word, crosses it out, of course. And Basquiat said that when he crosses out the word, he actually wants you to read it even more. So he marks it by crossing it out. He further adds hints like a dog guarding the pharaoh, or fascinating, the Eye of Horus. And what's most fascinating when you look at, he actually continues in between with the eye. So the eyes actually, it's like two eyes looking at each other. It's the boats, the ships, which could be either the historic ancient ships drawn from the Egypt high culture, or it could also reference and is also referencing the slave ships and the Middle Passage. He does it twice, but here even the sickle is actually a shape of a boat from the rock drawings of ancient times. He adds Nuba, which means Nubia on the one hand side, but Nuba is also the romanized word of Nubia, Anuba. But we discussed, and Alex also brought to the attention that the Nuba is a tribe more in center Sudan, but it's still on the Nile. So, and while Nubia is northern. So nothing speaks against that Basquiat was precisely using the word that he was using, because sometimes people say he forgot the I. No. He exactly knew what he would be doing. You have St. George on the left-hand side, in the left corner, Mucha woman, sold. And there is the discussion, what does he mean with sold? There's one clear evidence that it's the polarity of salt and pepper, whiteness, blackness. On the other hand, it also terms, of course, the idea of trade, of the salt trade, which was very an important trading way. But it's when you look at other works, it's more about the polarity of the term. He uses the same green oil stick color by writing Nile and making the symbol of water. So, and of course, also the writing on the upper right corner in the middle panel referencing ancient writing again. So it is one of the absolute most complex works. For example, just see the vegetation on the right right down corner, which actually is something he would more use 84, 85, so which doesn't really turn up before, and the poison hemlock, of course, as well, and the spider. So there is so much complexity to this work, and I have not even started.
Thank you, Dieter. We'll get further with that. Antwaun, you referenced many times that the history around a painting or work of art is very important, the narrative that comes from it. Obviously, this painting lends itself more than many other Basquiats for a narrative. And I'm not going to ask you, Banal, what do you think of the narrative, because we all understand it. But how do you see it? What is the meaning for a new generation of this narrative? What does it mean that in 1983, the first, let's call it acknowledged black artist in the Western society paints a painting like this?
Yeah. Good morning. Thanks for that history, Dieter. I think that if you're, thinking about this notion of history or historical painting, this particular work, it almost has it's a counter-historical painting, right? So when you think about history painting and the way that we think about it in the history of art, you really sort of think about, Napoleon, you think about sort of like a reanimation of power, right? And sort of a master narrative. And so as Dieter laid out, there's so many different sort of histories colliding across these three panels, right? He talked about Memphis, obviously. You're thinking about sort of the lower Nile sort of civilization or capital, but then also Memphis, Tennessee, where Martin Luther King was killed, et cetera, right? But you also sort of think about, these symbols as symbols of, displacement, his own displacement. I think one of the things that's sort of interesting about this particular work is not only is he narrating sort of the history of, Africa and African American life, he's also narrating his own histories, right? And sort of what have it meant to be a young, I think it was 22 when he painted this painting, young artist living in New York with the sort of attention that he was getting around this time, but also, his own homelessness, right? And so you can't think about displacement without thinking about, sort of the artist's own displacement and living on the street and being a street artist and, all those things. And so I think that for me, the history here is sort of not necessarily, or the most interesting thing about the history here is not necessarily the linear sort of, readings around sort of, the building up of, ancient Egypt civilization and the destruction of that, or, but also his own, the way that he's sort of connecting his own sort of life to that, right? And then, because this painting is, from 1983 and we're in 2023, quite a bit of history has happened, right? In relationship to Black artists and the way that Black artists have, since Basquiat made their own mark on the history of painting or thinking about sort of art history and taking that back, clear sort of parallels to, with Carrie James Marshall, entire mission with his paintings, right, have been. But then there's also this idea that, in the moment and in the market, there's a lot of attention on young Black artists, right? At the time of him painting this, he was a young Black artist, right? And so I think you have that navigation as well, right? What does it mean to sort of represent, Blackness? What is it, and the way that, that sort of, I call it a fight, but we can sort of talk about a different term, but sort of the African mask, right? And sort of the way that he's sort of digging at, this idea of primitive art, this idea of, Picasso and the way that he used the mask and sort of reclaiming of that history and the reclaiming of the mask for Black people, right? And so I think that when you're thinking about histories, you really have to sort of think about sort of counter narratives that he was painting and putting down, and why those narratives were important to a young Black artist.
I like your take very much on the anti-history painting, because it fits very much with me, with the narrative that I built in my head around Basquiat, because it was about the anti-hero, it was about the anti, it was about being different, it was about being alone, it was about fighting a fight that nobody really knew how to fight back then in 1983. I think, as you say, we're much more educated now, we're much more progressed, we know much more what it's about, but back then we didn't. So for him to turn George Washington crossing the Delaware on his head, because that's what he's doing, because there's not George Washington riding on top of the line with all of his fellows. No, that's a different kind of history that fits into the narrative. Dieter, for you more, Basquiat comes out in '81. He's still wild, he's still gritty, he's very streety. In 1982, he creates these single figures, the iconic figures of the hero, the boxer, the warrior. And then starting in '82, but mostly in '83, with little references before, he goes more historical, more knowledgeable. So actually his style changes a little bit, because rather than the one single figure, the iconic figure, he goes to a narrative, or, as I really like now, an anti-narrative style. So how does that fit in the broader view?
I mean, what's very important in the understanding of Basquiat is that it's very conceptual based, his art, from the beginning. When he started with this conceptual graffiti in public space together with LDS under the pseudonym of Sam or copyright, that was very different to graffiti, street art. It was like a conceptual project of an artist. From there, yes, the grittiness of the early works that fascinated, let's say it like this, I've met 50 to 60 people who literally quote that they have discovered Basquiat. today. So those people, yeah, 50, 60 of them, they were taken by the grittiness of his work, but it was conceptual, and that's so fascinating to me. And what you see here for me is like a knowledge room. It's like really, and it's not linear at all. It's like we work today. He picks from here and there and combines different kind of knowledges, but we can go so deep about one word. We could write a book about one word and one painting, and that's the craziness about it. But from 80, 81, he he started to work a lot on canvas when he was working in the basement of Nina Neusay gallery. And because he had the access to it, and then he created, as Alex, you just pointed out, I mean, the single figure, the boxer, he created, don't forget the jazz singers, Charlie Parker, his great hero. But already in August 82, he would start with the exposed stretcher paintings, as this is one of them. And if he had different panels, he would actually switch them. He would kind of copy-paste them. The same method, like in hip-hop, he was rapping in a way. And in 82, end of 82, beginning 83, he reached the highest complexity in his work. And this is like the incarnation of the highest complexity, which can give you so much, and which can start so many different ways to look at history in this case, but look at art history as well.
Thank you. Antwaun, one more question to go back to this, because you referenced it before. And he was 22 when he painted this. It's pretty amazing what he has done. I do think he opened up a perspective that was not seen before. You are someone that pays attention to not just the work, but the broader picture of the, let's call it, just because I'm Austrian and he will know the reference, the Gesamtkunstwerk à la Koloman-Moser. But there's more to it, and I believe there's more to Basquiat than just his expression on canvas about who he is. What does it mean in today's society? What does it mean for Black young artists today to stand not maybe behind Basquiat, but follow after Basquiat? How relevant is it today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that there were a lot of artists working before Basquiat that weren't acknowledged, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think that the caveat is that there were folks dealing with, these complicated histories, and the art world for what it was then didn't acknowledge, that work, and there's a whole history of people, and artists, great artists, some of which are still living now, who are also dealing with these things, before this sort of painting arrives in 1983. But I do think that that acknowledgement is important, the critical acknowledgement that opened doors for the possibility of a lot of different Black artists, but also younger artists too, right? So it's not just sort of like, like the art world has changed so dramatically, since the 1980s, and even like the question of like young artists sort of being able to show at the levels they're showing in museums and galleries and what have you. That's even a new development, right? Like, if you will. And so I think that, like, to not overstate it, but I think that it's important to have sort of, generational artists, like I could call them, that sort of open the doors for other possibilities, and I think that Basquiat was one of those artists, but I think that, even to sort of think about, and this is a weird sort of connection, but even to think about sort of, if you think about sort of what's happening in Black photography right now, you think about sort of the Vogue cover with Tyler Mitchell, 2018 of Beyonce, that opened up a sort of a whole conversation. Was Tyler the first artist to sort of, take images like it? No, but it allowed for a conversation, right? And I think that this painting also allowed for other artists' perspectives, some who came before him even, right? Mm-hmm. So if one of the references in the materials were to Kerry James Marshall. Obviously, Kerry James Marshall's career develops long before Basquiat's. Even David Hammond's, all these artists that sort of precedes him, that I think allowed for their sort of messages and the way that they were sort of exploring art history and sort of the more formal sort of aspects to sort of come through, right, and sort of to be seen, right? And so I think that in that way, he was definitely an important figure in what we call now Black, art history.
Absolutely. No, and thank you for pointing that out, because obviously it is that way that there's always more history than we acknowledge and we know about. So sometimes one event, and in this case it was Basquiat, I think opened up a much longer standing history, like you said, and made us now look also back and aside and everywhere around it. But Basquiat was just the one that we're all pinning it to opening it up, because he was the one that sat here in the midst of a very advanced, I think, cultural political New York in the mid-'80s or in the early '80s, but it was a very white-dominated art world that existed here, and it was Warhol, and that's always fascinating, the relationship with Warhol, because it started in 1982, 83. What that did in order to propel everything, and I always give Warhol more credit than anyone else, because I think there's a lot there. I think there's something to say that in Dieter, you're just coming off a great show with collaborations between Warhol and Basquiat. Like that these guys work together, coexisted, is quite something.
I mean, what's important to say is that Basquiat had fully developed his ideas, his concepts, his knowledge rooms when he was formally introduced to Warhol. As all young artists in New York, artists as Basquiat was, all of them were interested in the work of Warhol, there's no question. So he sold him 2 postcards in 1979. Glenn O'Brien brought Basquiat once to the factory, but they formally met, introduced by Bruno Bischofberger in the fall 1982. And from there, they slowly developed a friendship. And in the end, 1983, they had developed that friendship. And these collaborations they did were mainly, you can mainly describe them with respect, but it was also, of course, a dialectic space they created, because they came from 2 different world views. So meaning you have Warhol, very interested to bring, you can say, critique or not critique, again, with icons, with symbols from like the $sign. But Basquiat, what would he do? He would bring in the snake from the Gadsden flag. He would counter, actually, Warhol. But the respect made it possible that they would create these great collaborations together.
Well, I think that, if I can.
No, please, Antwaun.
I think that sort of example is sort of really important to, I think, our understanding of this painting, right? Because you sort of think about this idea of history, or what Basquiat did or didn't do for, the advancement of, Black contemporary art, and it's simply that, it was always about sort of, when you think about it, history, you always have to say to yourself, like, history for who, right? And so, like, and I think it's the translating, right, that sort of is happening in this painting, but also in that relationship that I think made a lot of things possible for a lot of artists, right? So it made things possible in the immediate for Basquiat to have Warhol and sort of co-sign him, if you will. But then it also opened up a world of possibilities for other artists, who benefited from that relationship, and so I'm always, it's that tension, like right. that occurs, in this, painting, but also, in the way that we sort of we've lived art history, or who gets to write it, or who gets to see it in a museum, all of those choices, right? And so I think that like the way that he, sort of has these double and triple meanings with words, and with different sort of motifs, is about sort of challenging that, right? Like, whose history is it? What are you seeing? It's a lot more philosophical, I think, than just simply thinking about sort of a transatlantic, history of Black people and the movement of Black people, right? Some of what he was commenting was like, like even when you talked about salt, right? Mm-hmm. Salt is, at the end of the day, something that preserves, right? Like it's about preservation, right?
As well.
And so it's about the value and the wealth and the wars that were fought around salt, but it's also about what does it mean to preserve myself as a Black man, right? And so that's why it occurs all the time in the paintings and all, so it's not just, like it really is sort of a lot more in the present, this painting for him, right? Despite the fact that he's, obviously referencing ancient and more contemporary histories.
But I think that the salt conversation is a very interesting one, because your explanation now just opened up a whole thought in me, quite honestly, because I referenced, and I know Dieter's references, salt, pepper, black, white. Salt of the earth was always my reference, that it's like, it's mostly the salt appears on black background from an earthy, I don't know. I always saw that. But his words, his way of language, not just the pictorial language, but the actual language, was also something that actually was referenced obviously before, and we all know Dada and all of this where it's coming from, but the references combined with the visuals that he's doing is quite unique, and his language, in my opinion, is quite unique. Also, the writing and erasing is a very historical metaphor to life and to creation and to everything. So I think the words are important for him. So let's talk a little bit about the words, if you don't mind.
I mean, I think that's why they often refer to Basquiat as the first hip-hop, fine artist, is because at that time, you have the birth of hip-hop, but that's what, the rappers in New York were doing at the time, right? Mm-hmm. Wordplay on words like salt, and trying to sort of think through all the different connotations that can happen with a single word, right? And because identity is that complicated, right? There's never just one perspective on identity. But maybe you want to speak more to...
No, I mean, he has done works with just one word and fully executed work. So it is really, as you say, I mean, all the meanings. And that's so fascinating with him. There is not one answer. There's always multiple answers. And also how we differently associate it and how differently we think about it is part of the genius of Basquiat. And in this, as I always call them, knowledge rooms, that opens also up this discussion, because it is something very contemporary to create knowledge rooms, and at his time it was not a term existing actually. So in that sense, I see his relevance today in so many courts, and one of them is that he works in the way we work and we think even today. So that's one of the fascinations.
I love that. He puts in words how we live, how we think today. So I think that should give us all a big moment to think about this painting, to think about what it addresses. I wanted to ask you if you had any questions.
I will.
Dieter, go for it, please.
I start with an answer. Let's say it like this. Basquiat always worked parallel on several works. So he would prepare one canvas, one exposed stretcher. He would have, in this case, it looks like that he started on the 2 panels, for example, and then added the third one, which certainly he had been working on because it's a different size. So that points to that he added the third one in this case. In other cases, you know, the ones with the 3 panels, the small ones, this is like really just an exchange, and then he would adapt it. And so we will never be able to go in the mind of Basquiat, but he seemed, in the few video documents, him painting, he seemed very confident and clear about what he was doing, and he was never like crazy expressionistic at all. Even the elements that look expressionistic, they are actually painted in a very cool, slow way, so it was all floating. There is this term of intuition, which was coiled in relation of, for example, artists like Kurt Schwitters, how he did his collages. I would say Basquiat did his work like we recept our world today. And how do we do it? You have the browser windows open at the computer. You have, I don't know what else you have, but all this just comes in and gives you the inspiration. He often at the television and was looking at, let's say, a Hitchcock movie or The Little Rascals, or and had some other sound. He always had from jazz music to classic music to noise music he was creating himself with the band Grey. So it was all there, and he just picked from everything surrounding, and certainly had a starting point and then just created it. But thinking of Keith Haring, they had a very different approach, because Keith Haring, he started the line, and he had his alphabet was more limited than the one of Basquiat, because you see a drawing, I just saw a drawing, and then there is the card players by Otto Dix in it. Or there is suddenly something I've never ever seen before. So he's so rich. But what do you think, Antwaun?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about the videos that I've seen of him painting, and I think it is sort of, I guess the one additional thing I would add is, obviously, he was a reader, you know, obviously he was sort of referencing lots of sort of history books, and as like Robert F. Thompson has sort of pointed out, and others. And I think that I mean, from what I've seen, you know, the documentation I've seen, it seemed to be more intuitive than sort of a planning or, you know, sort of a building in that way. And he was sort of, in some ways, riffing off of himself is probably the best way to sort of describe it.
I think that's a good way of seeing it, because he obviously, like you referenced, he knows a lot more than he lets you.
Exactly.
Then, you know, he plays with us.
With the sort of word play or the use of the symbols, that he does know a lot more, right?
Exactly.
And you see it from this other works always. You see from his drawings how much more he knew. Yeah. So, and I mean, there's this nice story where he called himself as a list writer more than anything else, which then would come to the reading again. Right. So, yeah.
No, and which references, I mean, I think later on in life, in his short life, the word becomes even more prominent, and in some of the later works like Pegasus or something like that, the word becomes the dominant factor, where he is, I think, less afraid to let people know that he knows actually something, and he's not this kid from the East Village that doesn't know anything and paints wild, big orange and red figures. But this is where it starts, because again, if you analyze it, and we did, and we're coming now full circle, we're realizing actually that telling this, and I'm going back to you, Antwaun, in the anti-history, I love that because it really is what it is. It's counterculture in form of culture presented, which is the best. But that said, it means that he's just constantly developing, that he knows exactly what happens historically, but he's toying with the viewer, and he's encouraged us to think and interpret. He loves, I think, the interpretation of it. It comes natural for him that he writes and erases, but he lets it there for a reason, for us to come around and think about it, right?
Yeah, and then in many cases he covers it, but you can still read it. So it's still part of the story.
And I think that's the, again, erasing and making covering fits very well into the narrative of art.
In this history, right? Like, what your acts of erasure, right? Like, and so you're thinking about sort of histories, or he's pointing you towards, histories, Black histories that, were not and still not well known, right? And so, like that act of erasure, or, really sort of also, in some ways is an indictment, right? And
Yeah.
so, like, that toying with, sort of processes that had, removed histories, right? Rendered certain histories illegible, right? And so I think that also is sort of happening with his mark making, right? It's a direct comment on the sort of sorts of histories that we maybe or maybe not have access to, and how those histories or the erasure of those histories have organized whole sort of countries or identities.
All of this plays into, like, if you hear us speak about him in this subject that we covered now, and again, the covering of his thing, I think there's the language of Basquiat, the words, but also, he covers a lot in his paintings. He goes over a lot, sometimes not words, but sometimes paint. I think that has a lot to do. And again, this covering, uncovering is, in my opinion, one of the most meaningful contribution, because if you cover something up, there's something behind that we need to address. And I think that's for me, his big contribution for the future generations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe I'll put on my Gagosian director hat for this one. I don't think you have a Black art market without Basquiat, right? I mean, he is basically the entire market, So, like, if you just look at the numbers, he is basically the entire market. And so I think that, on one hand, there's just so much more work to be done in terms of, like, the market aspect around Black art, right? And I think that, still, all these years on, if you want to use 2000 as sort of the sort of watershed moment, you still, are in a situation where, Black artists still do not have the sort of level of market share that other artists or other artists of other races have, right? Or basically white artists, right? Because I think everyone else is sort of worse off than that. And so I think that's the market part of it, right? That's the market reality. But I do think that in this moment where, there seems to be a real sort of genuine, if I can sort of use that in terms of the market, there seems to be a real genuine appreciation and understanding of sort of these younger artists, and wanting to sort of, meet with collectors all the time, who have collected, cross generations, who are interested to sort of figure out how these artists, young Black artists that I work with particularly, fit into the history of their collections and fit into the history of art, which I find encouraging, right? And so, that history piece that we're sort of talking about here is sort of playing out in sort of an everyday sense, As for the artist, I always liken, in terms of inspiration, I always say that, he's almost like a Picasso-like figure, right? Like, how could you not deal with him, right? Like, if you're engaged in the arena of, art, you have to deal with him, and that has been his contribution, right? And as singular as this painting suggests, it has been, and so whether it's being said or not, in some ways, is irrelevant because he's always there, in terms of the long shadow he cast over a market and making other markets possible for Black artists, right? And so I think that, again, is why he is so important, and I think why we're all gathered here on the Sunday morning.
Dieter, maybe from your perspective, because again, and we all know this, but your shows, the Basquiat one, the collaboration one, really had an impact on the art world. So thank you for that, number one. And second is the phenomenon, because European shows, European audience, like what did you experience? I saw them, but I didn't experience the aftermath, and I come from a New York perspective. So I'm curious to hear that too.
The first large-scale show and we did at the Fondation Bayerle in now 13 years ago, showed how different Basquiat speaks to the art public. So it was incredible how an esteemed museum, but with a certain actually conservative public at that time, was shown a very different reception. And you suddenly saw people at the Fondation Bayerle I would not have seen before when I did an Edvard Munch show years before there. And that was incredible. And the following show at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris, and then, of course, the one at Fondation Louis Vuitton, so Musée d'Art Moderne, and then years later, it was incredible how vivid, how diverse, how engaged the people. They were sitting on the floor, drawing, were communicating with the works. And even, and that's interesting, in the Albertina in Vienna, one of the most conservative museums in the world, I know.
We both know.
We both know too well. I mean, you have to consider it was the second most successful exhibition of all times in the Albertina, and it was just beaten by Albrecht Dürer, where they had shown works you will never see again, so people had to go. And it even bet my own Munch show. So, meaning Basquiat is here, and it was the first time, even the Herring show we did there attracted some more younger public, but it was the only show I saw that showed really, finally, people entering a museum that have never entered this museum, at least before. And that's incredible. So Basquiat is so much more than when you speak about the market or you speak about him as the door opener, as what he absolutely is, but he's also really a door opener for people who connect the first time with a museum, and that's fantastic.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for coming. I want to end this with saying that I think that was so meaningful because we've learned, or we realized, that Basquiat is so meaningful for the art, but meaningful also for the culture. I honestly mean this. I think Basquiat speaks to generations. I see it. A personal story, my younger son, Henry, who's not so interested in art, suddenly a flag of 3 crowns shows up from Amazon and gets mounted over his bed. I was like, you know what this is? He's like, it's Basquiat. I was like, you know anything about this? Like, no, but it speaks to me. That's meaningful, and I think it gives a chance to have art go beyond what it used to be and what we grew up with, this little narrative that is just on a pure intellectual basis. It opens up to people, and I think that's one of Basquiat's huge contributions to it, and I'm thankful for that, and I'm thankful for you guys coming and talking to us and entertaining a half intellectual, half commercial conversation. And thank you for coming to visit and listen.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.